The alarm on my console flared red before I had even finished my morning report, and I knew, without looking twice, that something had crossed into our sector that should not have been able to reach us so quietly. My name is Vrey Kesik, and on the day the human ship arrived, I was the youngest liaison officer ever assigned to the Thren Compact Border Station, and I was about to make the worst mistake of my life without even realizing it had begun. The station around me came alive with quiet panic. Officers moved faster than usual, speaking in clipped words, glancing at screens that showed a single vessel gliding toward us with no escort, no visible weapons, and no explanation. Our sensors could not find a single defense system active on its hull. To my superiors, this was either supreme confidence or supreme foolishness, and nobody could decide which. I had heard stories about humans since I was young, the way every species in the compact had heard stories. They were the ones who came from a small, quiet system nobody had bothered to study closely until it was too late to ignore them. They were said to have clawed their way through their own history in ways other species found difficult to imagine, and then walked out into the stars with a calm that unsettled everyone who met them. I had always dismissed these stories as exaggeration, the kind of tale told to frighten young officers into taking their studies seriously. Now their ship was less than an hour from docking, and every station commander above me looked as though they wished they were somewhere else. Elder Corvain, the ranking officer of our post, called me into his office before the ship had even completed its approach. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me that I had been chosen to serve as the official liaison for this arrival, because I spoke their trade language fluently, because I had studied their limited public records more thoroughly than anyone else on the station, and because, in his own words, no one senior wanted the responsibility if something went wrong. I remember asking him what exactly could go wrong with a single unarmed ship approaching a fully defended station. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said that in the entire history of the compact, no other species had ever approached a border post without at least a token show of strength, a symbol of readiness, something to prove they could defend themselves if provoked. The humans had sent nothing, not a warning shot, not a show of force, not even a formal request through the usual diplomatic channels. Just a simple message, translated into our language with unsettling precision, asking for docking rights, and in their words, a conversation. That single detail bothered him more than any weapon could have. I did not understand his unease at the time. I thought he was overreacting to a species that clearly wanted peaceful contact. I walked out of his office already forming opinions about how I would handle the meeting, how I would demonstrate the strength and composure of my own people in front of visitors who had, by every account I had read, barely survived their own history. The ship was called the Quiet Reckoning, according to the identification signal it broadcast as it entered docking range. The name struck me as strange, almost poetic, nothing like the aggressive designations I expected from a species with humanity's reputation. I stood at the observation window with two junior officers beside me, watching the vessel slide into the docking clamps with a precision that made our own engineers murmur in quiet admiration. It was smaller than I expected, sleek, practical, without the ornamental plating many species use to signal their status. If anything, it looked almost humble, and that humility felt like its own kind of message, though I could not yet read it. The docking doors opened with a soft hiss, and the first human I ever saw in person stepped through with an ease that surprised me. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and calm eyes that swept the room once before settling on nothing in particular. He wore a simple uniform, dark blue with silver trim, nothing like the ceremonial armor I had read about in old reports. Behind him came two more crew members, a woman with short auburn hair and a quiet smile, and a younger man who looked barely old enough to serve, carrying a small case that I later learned held gifts for the station commander. The tall man introduced himself as Captain Nathan Ray, commanding officer of the Quiet Reckoning. His voice was low, steady, and carried none of the aggression I had braced myself for. He greeted Elder Corvain with a respectful nod and thanked him for allowing the ship to dock, as though he were a guest arriving at someone's home rather than the commander of a vessel that had made half our station's defense grid nervous. I stood a few steps behind Corvain, watching the exchange with a strange mixture of curiosity and disappointment. I had expected something dramatic, something that matched the fear I had seen in my superior's eyes. Instead, I saw ordinary people speaking ordinary words, and I began to wonder if the entire reputation of humanity had been built on exaggeration and fear of the unknown rather than anything real. That feeling of disappointment would follow me for the rest of the day, shaping every decision I made, and I did not yet understand how dangerous that kind of certainty could be. Corvan assigned me to escort the human delegation to their guest quarters and to remain available for any translation needs during their stay. I accepted the assignment with more confidence than I probably deserved, already imagining myself as the officer who would prove that humanity's reputation was nothing more than galactic rumor. As I led them through the corridors, he answered easily, describing the long stretch of empty space they had crossed, the quiet routines of shipboard life, the small rituals his crew kept to mark the passing of days without a sun to guide them. Nothing he said matched the stories of conquest and devastation I had grown up hearing in hushed voices among older officers. It was the woman with auburn hair, introduced to me as Grace Ellison, the ship's medical officer, who first mentioned the quartermaster. She spoke of him with a kind of quiet respect I found strange, coming from a colleague rather than a subordinate. She said he had served longer than anyone else aboard the Quiet Reckoning, that he kept the ship running in ways that went far beyond his official duties, and that he carried himself with a stillness that some of the younger crew found almost unsettling until they understood it. I asked where this quartermaster was, curious about a figure who seemed to command such quiet reverence. She told me he would join them later, once the ship had finished securing its systems for the docking period, and that he preferred to arrive without ceremony. I filed the information away without much thought, more interested in cataloging details for my report than in understanding what kind of man inspired that tone of voice from his crewmates. The guest quarters we had prepared were modest by our standards, though the humans seemed genuinely pleased with them, remarking on small details like the temperature control and the view of the docking bay through a reinforced window. I found their easy satisfaction almost insulting, as though they expected so little that anything adequate impressed them. I did not yet understand that humans had learned, through hard experience, to value comfort without demanding luxury, a lesson many other species had never needed to learn. That evening, Elder Corvan announced a formal banquet to welcome the human delegation, a traditional gesture extended to any visiting dignitaries of note. I was tasked with organizing the details, coordinating between our kitchen staff and the human crew to ensure nothing in the meal would cause them harm or discomfort. It was tedious work, checking ingredient lists against records the humans had provided, translating instructions back and forth, but it gave me an excuse to spend more time near the human officers, listening for anything that might reveal the truth behind their reputation. It was during this preparation that I first heard the name that would occupy my thoughts for weeks afterward. Marcus Adalwin, the younger crewman, the one who had carried the case of gifts, mentioned him while helping arrange seating for the banquet. He said that Marcus always insisted on wearing his formal armor to gatherings like this, regardless of how informal the occasion, and that the tradition went back further than anyone currently serving could properly explain. I asked what kind of armor a quartermaster would need for a diplomatic dinner, genuinely confused by the idea. The young man only shrugged and said it was not really about need. He said it was something else entirely, something he did not feel qualified to explain, and that I should ask Marcus myself if I wanted the real answer. I decided I would. By the time the banquet began, the main hall of the station had been transformed, with careful lighting and long tables arranged in the traditional compact style, meant to encourage conversation across every seat, rather than isolating guests by rank. Elder Corvain sat at the head of the table, flanked by senior officers from 3 neighboring outposts who had traveled in specifically to witness this historic meeting. I was seated closer to the human delegation, my official role requiring me to remain available for any translation difficulties that might arise during the evening. Captain Ray arrived first, followed by Grace Ellison and several other crew members whose names I had not yet learned. They took their seats with a kind of relaxed confidence that seemed almost out of place, given the weight of the occasion, and I found myself studying their expressions, searching for any hint of the calculation or hidden agenda I still expected to find beneath their friendly exteriors. Marcus Adalwin entered last. I noticed him immediately, not because of any dramatic entrance, but because of the sudden shift in the room's attention. Conversations paused. Even members of my own delegation, who had spent the entire day dismissing human reputation as exaggeration, straightened in their seats without seeming to realize they had done so. He wore the armor exactly as described, dark plating etched with symbols I did not recognize, worn smooth in places by what could only have been decades of handling. It did not gleam with the polish of ceremonial display. It looked lived in, carried rather than merely worn, and there was something in the way he moved beneath its weight that suggested he had grown so used to it that its presence barely registered to him anymore. He was older than the rest of his crew, his hair more gray than brown, his face marked by the kind of lines that came from years rather than mere age. His eyes, when they finally settled on me during a brief introduction, held none of the calculation I expected. Instead, I saw something closer to patience, the kind of expression I associated with elders who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. Elder Corvain welcomed him formally, and Marcus responded with a simple nod and a few words of thanks, his voice deep and unhurried. He took his seat without further ceremony, and the meal continued as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I could not stop watching him throughout the first course, trying to understand why a single quartermaster commanded more silent attention than his own captain. I asked Grace Ellison quietly, hoping she might finally explain the reverence I kept sensing around him. She only smiled and said that some things were better explained by Marcus himself, if he chose to explain them at all. That answer frustrated me more than any refusal could have. I had spent the entire day gathering information, building a picture of humanity that I was increasingly convinced was built on nothing more than old fear and exaggerated rumor, and yet here was a detail I could not immediately dismiss or explain away. A quartermaster, not a warrior, not a commander, treated with a kind of quiet reverence by his own crew, simply because of the armor he wore to dinner. I decided, somewhere between the second and third course, that I would find my own answer that night, and that whatever mystery surrounded Marcus Adalwin's armor, I would uncover it before the evening ended. I did not yet understand that some answers, once given, cannot be taken back, and that the question I was about to ask would change far more than a single dinner conversation. As the meal wound toward its later courses, conversation around the table grew louder, more animated, fueled by the kind of relief that comes when two unfamiliar groups realize an evening is passing without incident. Officers from the neighboring outposts began asking Captain Ray about human history, about the worlds they had left behind, about the long journey that had brought the quiet reckoning so far from home. He answered each question with the same easy patience he had shown throughout the day, offering just enough detail to satisfy curiosity, without revealing anything that felt truly personal. I noticed that whenever the conversation drifted toward humanity's past, toward the deeper history that had shaped them into the species now sitting calmly at our table, Captain Ray would gently redirect the discussion, always with a smile, always without appearing evasive. It was skillfully done, and I found myself both impressed and increasingly suspicious of what exactly he was avoiding. Marcus, throughout all of this, said very little. He ate quietly, answered direct questions with brief, polite responses, and otherwise seemed content to observe the room rather than participate in its performance. I found his silence more intriguing than anything Captain Ray had said all evening, and the growing sense that something significant was being deliberately left unspoken settled deeper into my thoughts with every passing course. By the time dessert arrived, I had convinced myself of a narrative that fit neatly into everything I already believed about humanity. I decided that Marcus wore his armor not out of some deep, meaningful tradition, but as a calculated display, a quiet reminder to everyone around him of the violence his species was capable of, dressed up in the language of respect and ritual. I decided that his silence was not patience but arrogance, the confidence of someone who did not need to prove himself because his reputation did the work for him. I was wrong about almost everything, but that night, Sitting at that long table with the lights low and the conversation buzzing pleasantly around me, I believed I finally understood the truth behind humanity's unsettling reputation, and I felt a strange, misplaced pride in having seen through what I believed was a carefully constructed performance. That pride would not survive the hour. As servers began clearing the final plates, Elder Corvain rose to offer a formal toast, thanking the human delegation for their peaceful arrival and expressing hope for continued cooperation between our peoples. The room applauded politely, glasses raised, and for a moment, everything felt like it might end exactly as these diplomatic gatherings were meant to end, with cautious goodwill and the promise of future meetings. I should have let the evening close there. I had every opportunity to remain silent, to let my private theories remain private, to simply observe and report as my role required. Instead, emboldened by wine I was not accustomed to, and by the false confidence of my own conclusions, I turned toward Marcus as the applause faded and asked the question I had been building toward all evening, my voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. I asked him, with a politeness I now recognize as thin and performative, whether the armor he wore was meant to remind us of what his species was capable of, or whether it was simply a costume worn by a species too young and too uncertain of its place among the stars to feel secure without some symbol of strength close at hand. The words left my mouth easily, almost proudly, and I remember the brief, satisfied feeling of having finally said aloud what I believed everyone else at the table had been too polite to voice. The room did not immediately react. For a moment, I thought perhaps my words had simply been absorbed into the general noise of the gathering, unnoticed, harmless. Then I saw Grace Ellison's expression change, her easy smile fading into something careful and still. I saw the younger crewmen beside her go quiet in a way that felt heavier than mere silence. I saw Captain Ray's eyes flick toward Marcus with an expression I could not quite read, something between concern and quiet warning, and I saw Marcus himself. He did not respond immediately. He set down the small cup he had been holding with deliberate care, the kind of careful movement that suggested enormous effort to remain steady. His eyes, when they finally met mine, no longer held the patient calm I had noticed earlier in the evening. Instead, I saw something close, something that reminded me uncomfortably of a door settling shut, quiet and final, with no anger visible on the surface, but something far heavier moving beneath it. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue or defend himself or offer any of the explanations I had half expected, half hoped for, in the moment after my question left my mouth. Instead, he rose from his seat, slowly and without hurry, and began, piece by piece, to remove the armor he had worn into that hall. The room fell completely silent as he worked, his movements methodical, unhurried, almost ceremonial in their own strange way. He set each piece down on the table in front of him with a care that felt like the opposite of anger, more like grief, more like the careful handling of something precious being laid to rest. When the final piece rested on the table before him, he looked at me once more, and though his voice remained quiet, every word carried with perfect clarity through the silent hall. He said that he hoped, one day, I would understand exactly what I had just called a costume. Then he turned and walked out of the banquet hall without another word, leaving his armor behind him on the table, gleaming faintly under the low lights, and leaving me sitting frozen in my seat with the terrible, immediate understanding that I had made a mistake I did not yet fully comprehend, but one that I somehow already knew I would spend a very long time trying to undo. The rest of the hall remained silent long after the door closed behind him, and in that silence I felt the full weight of every eye in the room turning slowly toward me. The silence in the banquet hall stretched so long that I began to believe it would never break, that every officer and dignitary present would simply sit frozen in that dim light forever, staring at the empty seat where Marcus Adalwin had been sitting only moments before. Then Elder Corvain cleared his throat, a small sound that somehow carried across the entire room, and the spell shattered into a dozen quiet, uncomfortable conversations that none of the participants seemed to want me to hear. Captain Ray did not raise his voice or demand an apology. He simply rose from his seat with the same unhurried calm his quartermaster had shown moments earlier, thanked Elder Corvain for the evening in a tone that gave nothing away, and gathered his crew with a small gesture that needed no words. Grace Ellison did not look at me as she stood, though I felt the weight of her disappointment more sharply than any accusation could have delivered. The younger crewmen collected the case of gifts they had brought, still unopened, and followed the others toward the door without a backward glance. Within minutes, the human delegation had left the hall entirely, and I remained seated at the long table with the armor still resting exactly where Marcus had placed it, each piece catching the low light in a way that made it impossible to look away from. Elder Corvain did not speak to me that night. He simply looked at me once, a long, measuring look that told me everything I needed to know about how badly I had damaged something I did not yet understand, and then he walked away with the other senior officers, leaving me alone in a hall that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my quarters replaying the moment over and over, searching for some way to convince myself that my words had been reasonable, that any offense taken was an overreaction, born of pride, rather than genuine hurt. I told myself that a species with humanity's history should expect difficult questions, that diplomacy required honesty, even when honesty was uncomfortable, that I had done nothing more than voice what others were too cautious to say aloud. None of these justifications brought me any comfort, and by the time the station's artificial morning cycle began, I understood that I had been lying to myself all night simply to avoid facing the plain, uncomfortable truth that I had caused real harm to someone who had done nothing to deserve it. I was summoned to Elder Corvain's office before I had even finished my morning preparations. He did not offer me a seat when I arrived, which told me immediately how serious this conversation would be. He stood by the window overlooking the docking bay, where the quiet reckoning remained motionless in its clamps, its running lights dim, its usual traffic of crew moving between ship and station completely absent. He asked me, without turning around, whether I understood what I had done the previous night. I told him honestly that I did not fully understand, but that I recognized I had caused offense, and was prepared to apologize formally to Marcus and to the human delegation as soon as they would allow it. He turned to face me then, and his expression held none of the anger I expected, only a tired kind of disappointment that felt somehow worse. He told me that an apology, however sincere, might not be enough, because what I had insulted was not simply a piece of ceremonial equipment, but something the humans held with a depth of meaning our own people had never needed to develop, because our history, whatever its hardships, had never demanded the same kind of reckoning theirs had. I asked him what he meant, my earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a growing uncomfortable awareness that I had been operating the entire time on assumptions I had never bothered to question. He told me that in all his years overseeing first contact protocols, he had never seen a species react to insult the way the humans had reacted the previous night. No anger, no demand for retribution, no formal complaint lodged through diplomatic channels, simply silence, and a closing of doors that felt, in his words, far more dangerous than any outburst could have been. He explained that in the brief communications received from the quiet reckoning that morning, Captain Ray had requested nothing beyond a temporary halt to all further cultural exchange activities, citing what he described only as a need for his crew to process recent events. No accusation, no anger in the message itself, only a quiet, formal request that felt, according to Corvain, like the calm before something none of us yet understood how to prepare for. I asked whether this meant the humans intended some kind of retaliation, and Corvain's answer chilled me more than any threat could have. He said he did not know, and that not knowing was precisely what frightened him. He ordered me to learn everything I could about what that armor actually meant to the humans, insisting that I could not properly repair what I had broken until I understood the full weight of what I had said. He gave me access to every record the station possessed regarding human history and culture, most of it fragmentary, translated imperfectly from limited public archives that compact scholars had gathered over the decades since first contact with the wider human diaspora had become possible. I spent the following hours buried in those records, searching for any mention of ceremonial armor, of inherited symbols, of traditions passed between generations. Most of what I found was frustratingly vague, written by scholars who had clearly never spoken directly with a human about the deeper meaning behind their customs, relying instead on surface observation and cautious speculation. It was in the ship's own medical bay, 3 days later, that I finally found someone willing to give me a real answer. Grace Ellison had remained aboard the Quiet Reckoning during the period of silence that followed the banquet, tending to routine medical needs among the crew while the rest of the ship maintained its quiet, closed posture toward the station. I requested permission to speak with her, uncertain whether she would agree, and was surprised when she allowed me aboard without hesitation, though her expression remained guarded in a way it had not been during our earlier, easier conversations. She met me in a small medical office near the ship's central corridor, its walls lined with equipment I did not recognize, and shelves holding neatly organized supplies that spoke to years of careful maintenance. She did not offer pleasantries, simply gestured for me to sit and waited for me to explain why I had come. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I did not understand what I had done, and that I needed to understand it before I could offer any apology that meant something rather than simply satisfying diplomatic obligation. She studied me for a long moment before finally speaking, and when she did, her voice carried none of the warmth I remembered from our first meeting, only a careful, measured seriousness that made clear how much weight her words carried. She told me that the armor Marcus wore had belonged to his grandmother, a woman named Eleanor, who had served during what humans referred to only as the Long Conflict, a period in their history so devastating that it had nearly ended their species entirely. She said that Eleanor had survived circumstances that most humans alive today could barely imagine, circumstances that had cost humanity so much that it had permanently altered the way they understood themselves and their place among the stars. I asked what exactly had happened during this long conflict, hoping for specific details that might help me understand the scale of what I was dealing with. Grace told me, gently but firmly, that some details were not hers to share, that the specifics belonged to the families who had lived through them, and that what mattered for my understanding was not the precise history, but the lesson humanity had carried forward from it. She explained that after the long conflict finally ended, humanity had made a collective decision, one that shaped nearly every aspect of how they approached the wider universe afterward. They decided that they would never again allow the kind of thinking that had led them to the edge of their own destruction to take root unchecked. They built new systems of governance, new philosophies of restraint, new traditions meant specifically to remind every generation that followed of exactly how close they had come to losing everything, so that no future generation would ever forget the cost of forgetting. The armor, she said, was part of that tradition, passed down through families who had lived through the worst of it, worn not as a display of strength, but as a physical reminder of everything that strength, misused, had nearly cost them. Every scratch and worn edge on Marcus's armor told a story of survival, of lessons paid for in ways I still did not fully understand, and carried forward specifically so that no descendant would ever wear it without remembering exactly why it existed. I sat in silence for a long moment after she finished speaking, trying to reconcile this new understanding with the careless words I had spoken at the banquet. I had accused that armor of being a costume, worn by a species too young and uncertain to feel secure without symbols of strength. In reality, I had insulted the memory of every person who had suffered through whatever the long conflict truly represented, dismissing their grief and their hard-won wisdom as nothing more than performance. I asked Grace whether Marcus would ever be willing to speak with me directly, whether there was any way to properly apologize for what I had said. She considered the question carefully before answering, and when she finally spoke, her tone had softened slightly, though it remained serious. She told me that Marcus was not a man who held grudges easily, that his role as quartermaster required a certain patience with the mistakes of others, but that what I had said had touched something deeper than ordinary offense. She said that if I truly wanted to make things right, I would need to do more than offer polite words of apology. I would need to demonstrate that I actually understood what I had disrespected, and that understanding, she warned, could not be rushed or performed for the sake of diplomatic convenience. I left the quiet reckoning that day with far more questions than answers, but for the first time since the banquet, I felt something other than shame or self-justification. I felt a genuine, urgent need to understand, not because my superiors demanded it of me, but because I had begun to realize how deeply I had misjudged an entire species based on assumptions I had never bothered to question. Over the following days, I continued gathering whatever fragments of human history I could find, cross-referencing old compact records with the careful, guarded hints Grace had offered me. Much of what I found remained frustratingly incomplete, humanity having shared only what they judged necessary for peaceful relations, keeping the deeper details of their painful history largely private, shared only among themselves. I began to understand, slowly, that this restraint was itself a kind of lesson, one I had completely failed to recognize during my earlier confidence. Humanity did not parade its history of suffering for sympathy or leverage. They carried it quietly, privately, allowing only careful glimpses to those who demonstrated genuine respect rather than idle curiosity. I had demonstrated neither respect nor genuine curiosity at that banquet table. I had demonstrated arrogance dressed up as diplomatic honesty, and the cost of that arrogance was becoming clearer to me with every passing hour. Elder Corvain summoned me again on the 5th day of the human delegation's continued silence, informing me that Captain Ray had finally responded to repeated requests for further dialogue, agreeing to a limited meeting focused solely on determining whether continued cooperation between our peoples remained possible after what had occurred. He told me that I would be present at this meeting, not as a punishment, though I suspected it partly served that purpose, but because Captain Ray had specifically requested my presence, along with a private message addressed only to me. I asked what the message said, my stomach tightening with an anxiety I had not felt since childhood. Corvain handed me a small data slate containing the message, and I read it, standing right there in his office, my hands unsteady as the words settled into my understanding. Captain Ray had written only a few short lines, but they carried more weight than any lengthy formal statement could have. He said that Marcus had asked him to pass along a simple request, that before any further diplomatic discussions took place, I should come to understand, not through records or second-hand accounts, but through direct conversation, exactly what had been lost in that single careless moment at the banquet table. He said that Marcus was willing to speak with me himself, if I was willing to listen without defending myself, without seeking justification, and without treating the conversation as merely another diplomatic obligation to be completed and reported. I looked up from the data slate to find Elder Corvain watching me carefully, waiting for my response. I told him I was ready, though in truth, I was not entirely certain that was true. I only knew that I could not continue carrying the weight of what I had done without at least attempting to understand it fully, whatever that understanding might cost me. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since the banquet, something in his expression softened slightly, as though he recognized in me a shift he had been waiting to see. He told me the meeting would take place the following day, aboard the quiet reckoning itself, at Marcus's own request. He said nothing further, simply dismissed me with a quiet reminder that whatever happened in that meeting would likely determine far more than my own standing within the delegation. I left his office that evening with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling over me, something between dread and a kind of desperate hope that I might still find a way to repair what my careless words had broken. I did not yet know what awaited me aboard that ship, or how much more I still had to learn about the species I had so confidently dismissed as young, uncertain, and undeserving of the quiet respect it had, in fact, earned through a history I was only beginning to comprehend. That night, for the first time since arriving at the station, I found myself hoping, quietly and without any real confidence, that Marcus Adalwin might be willing to give me the chance to prove I could become someone worthy of the understanding he was offering. The corridor leading to the meeting room aboard the Quiet Reckoning felt longer than it probably was, each step echoing softly against walls lined with quiet function rather than decoration. A young crewman I did not recognize escorted me in silence, offering no small talk, no polite gestures, only a brisk efficiency that told me the crew's earlier warmth had not yet returned, even if Marcus himself had agreed to speak with me. I had spent the entire previous night preparing, rehearsing words of apology, organizing everything I had learned from the fragmented records, and from Grace's careful explanation, trying to construct something that would demonstrate genuine understanding rather than performed remorse. By the time I reached the meeting room door, none of those rehearsed words felt adequate anymore. The room itself was small, functional, containing only a simple table and a few chairs arranged without any particular formality. Marcus sat waiting when I entered, dressed in the same plain uniform I had seen him wear during our first brief introduction, without the armor that had caused so much trouble between us. Seeing him without it felt strange, almost as though something essential had been temporarily set aside for this conversation, though I understood now that its absence carried no less meaning than its presence had. He gestured for me to sit across from him, and I did, my earlier confidence completely absent, replaced by a nervous uncertainty I had not felt in years. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He studied me with the same calm patience I remembered from the banquet, though something guarded remained behind his eyes, a caution that told me trust would need to be earned rather than simply assumed. I broke the silence first, offering the apology I had rehearsed the previous night, though the words felt clumsier aloud than they had in my private rehearsals. I told him that I understood now, at least partially, what his armor represented, that I had learned about the long conflict, about his grandmother Eleanor, about the tradition of carrying forward the memory of that suffering as a reminder rather than a display of strength. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until I finished speaking. Then he asked me a single question that caught me completely unprepared. He asked whether I actually understood what I had said, or whether I had simply memorized enough facts to construct an apology that sounded appropriately informed. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again, realizing I did not have an honest response ready. I had learned facts, dates, fragments of history, pieced together from records and second-hand accounts, but I had not truly grappled with what those facts meant, not in any way that went beyond intellectual understanding into something deeper. I told him honestly that I was not certain I understood, not fully, and that I had come hoping he might help me understand properly, rather than simply accepting an apology I was not yet capable of making with complete sincerity. Something in his posture shifted slightly at my answer, a small release of tension I had not noticed building until it eased. He told me that most people who came seeking forgiveness arrived with prepared speeches, hoping the right combination of words might smooth over the discomfort of what they had caused. He said my honesty, admitting I did not yet understand, was the first thing I had said since our meeting began, that he actually believed. He began, then, to tell me about his grandmother, not with the guarded caution Grace had shown, but with a quiet openness that surprised me, given how carefully humanity seemed to protect this particular history. He said Eleanor had been young when the long conflict began, barely more than a child, by the standards her own society had once used to measure adulthood. He said the conflict had started small, as such things often did, born from disagreements that seemed manageable at first, disagreements between nations and factions who believed, each in their own way, that their cause justified whatever cost might follow. He explained that the conflict had grown far beyond anyone's initial expectations, consuming resources, trust, and eventually entire regions of the world Eleanor had called home. He said that by the time it finally ended, the world she had known as a child no longer existed in any recognizable form, and the survivors, Eleanor among them, had been forced to build something entirely new from what remained. I asked, carefully, what exactly had been lost, hoping he might finally provide the specific details that had eluded me in every record I had studied. He paused for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. He said that what mattered was not the specific numbers or events, information that existed in human archives for anyone truly seeking it, but the deeper lesson his people had extracted from that suffering. He said that Eleanor, in the years following the conflict's end, had dedicated herself to a single principle that she passed down through every generation of her family that followed. She believed that strength without restraint was not strength at all, but simply another name for the same forces that had nearly destroyed everything she loved. He said the armor I had insulted had been hers, worn during the final years of the conflict, kept afterward not as a trophy of survival, but as a physical reminder of exactly how close humanity had come to losing itself entirely. She had passed it to her children with strict instructions that it never be worn with pride and strength, only with humility toward the cost that strength had nearly demanded. I sat in silence, absorbing this explanation, feeling the full weight of my earlier words settling over me with a clarity I had not yet experienced. I had called that armor a costume, a symbol of insecurity rather than strength. In reality, it represented the opposite of everything I had accused it of being. It was a deliberate rejection of unchecked strength, a physical reminder to never again let power go unquestioned. Marcus continued, explaining that every generation of his family who inherited that armor understood they were not inheriting a symbol of pride, but a responsibility. Each wearer carried forward not just the physical object, but the obligation to remember why it existed, to ensure that the lessons Eleanor had paid for so dearly were never forgotten by those who came after her. He told me that when he wore it to formal gatherings, he was not displaying humanity's capacity for destruction, as I had assumed. He was demonstrating humanity's ongoing commitment to remembering that capacity honestly, so that it might never again be unleashed without full understanding of its cost. I asked him, my voice quieter than I intended, whether my words at the banquet had specifically wounded this personal connection, or whether they had touched something broader about how humanity as a whole understood itself. He considered the question carefully before answering, and his response revealed a depth I had not expected. He said that my words had wounded both, though perhaps the broader wound ran deeper than the personal one. He explained that humanity, as a species, remained acutely sensitive to any suggestion that their history of suffering had been meaningless, or worse, that their careful efforts to build something better afterward were simply performance rather than genuine transformation. He said that when I called his armor a costume, worn by a species too young and insecure to feel safe without symbols of strength, I had inadvertently suggested that everything humanity had learned, everything they had sacrificed to learn it, amounted to nothing more than an elaborate show. He said this fear, that outsiders might see their hard-won wisdom as mere performance, ran deep within humanity's collective consciousness, shaped by centuries of watching other species dismiss their history as exaggeration or theatrical posturing, rather than genuine, painful truth. I felt something shift within myself as he spoke, a growing understanding that went beyond simple factual knowledge into something closer to genuine empathy. I began to see, for the first time, how my careless assumption at the banquet had touched a wound far older and far deeper than I had ever imagined, one shaped not just by Eleanor's personal suffering, but by generations of humanity's collective struggle to be understood, rather than merely feared or dismissed. I asked him, hesitantly, what I could possibly do to make amends for something that touched such a deep and collective wound. He was quiet for a long moment, considering my question with the same careful patience he had shown throughout our entire conversation. Finally, he told me that genuine understanding, the kind I seemed to be developing in that very moment, mattered more than any formal apology I might construct. He said that words alone could not undo what had been said, but genuine transformation, in how I understood and represented humanity going forward, might, over time, begin to repair some of the damage. He told me that he did not expect immediate perfection, only genuine effort, sustained not for a single ceremony or formal reconciliation, but carried forward in how I approached every future interaction between our peoples. I asked him whether he could ever truly forgive what I had said, given how deeply it had touched something so personal and so collectively significant. His answer surprised me with its simplicity. He said that forgiveness was not something that needed to be earned through elaborate gestures or perfect understanding. He said that he had already decided, before our conversation even began, that he was willing to forgive genuine ignorance, provided it transformed into genuine effort to understand better going forward. What he had needed from our conversation was not a performance of contrition, but evidence that I was capable of the kind of honest reflection that made forgiveness meaningful rather than merely convenient. I left that meeting with a completely different understanding than the one I had carried into it. I had arrived believing I needed to construct the perfect apology, the right combination of words that would smooth over the offense I had caused. I left understanding that what mattered far more was genuine transformation, a willingness to sit with discomfort and uncertainty long enough to actually learn something true, rather than simply seeking the fastest path back to comfortable diplomatic relations. Elder Corvain met me as I disembarked from the quiet reckoning, his expression carefully neutral as he studied my face for any sign of how the meeting had gone. I told him, honestly, that I did not yet know whether I had done enough to repair the damage I had caused, but that I understood, finally and completely, exactly what that damage had been. He nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with my answer in a way that surprised me, given how demanding he had been throughout the entire ordeal. He told me that understanding the wound was the necessary first step toward any genuine healing, and that whatever came next would depend on how I chose to carry that understanding forward, not just in words, but in actions that demonstrated real change rather than temporary performance. I spent that evening alone in my quarters, reflecting on everything Marcus had shared with me, feeling the weight of Eleanor's story settle into a place within my understanding that felt permanently altered. I thought about the generations of humans who had carried that armor forward, not as a trophy, but as a burden willingly accepted for the sake of remembering something too important to forget. I thought about my own people, about the assumptions we carried regarding humanity's reputation, assumptions built on fear and incomplete understanding, rather than genuine knowledge of what they had actually survived and what they had chosen to become afterward. I began to wonder how many other misunderstandings existed between our peoples, built on the same kind of careless assumption I had demonstrated so publicly at that banquet table. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, I felt something beyond simple regret. I felt a genuine curiosity, a desire to understand humanity, not as a curious species to be studied and categorized, but as people who had endured something profound and emerged with wisdom worth genuine respect, rather than casual dismissal. I did not yet know how much further this journey of understanding would take me, or how completely it would transform not just my relationship with Marcus and his crew, but my entire perspective on what it meant to truly understand another people, rather than simply observing them from a comfortable, judgmental distance. 3 days passed after my meeting with Marcus, before anything changed in any visible way, and during those days I found myself returning again and again to the records I had gathered, reading them now with completely different eyes. What had once seemed like fragmentary, frustratingly vague accounts now revealed patterns I had missed entirely during my first hurried review, patterns that spoke of a species far more thoughtful and deliberate than the reputation that preceded them among the wider galactic community. I began to notice how carefully humanity structured its public interactions with other species, always offering enough information to satisfy diplomatic requirements while protecting the deeper, more painful truths of their history from casual curiosity or exploitation. I understood now why Grace had been so careful in her explanations, why Marcus had chosen to share only what he judged necessary for genuine understanding rather than complete disclosure. It was not secrecy born of shame, but a kind of protective care, the same care a family might show toward a wound still healing, even generations after the original injury occurred. Elder Corvain called me to his office on the 4th morning, informing me that Captain Ray had requested a broader meeting, one that would include not just diplomatic representatives, but scientists and historians from both our peoples, hoping to establish a foundation of genuine mutual understanding rather than the surface-level cooperation that had characterized our relations up to that point. I asked whether this meant the earlier tension had finally begun to ease, and Corvain's answer carried a note of cautious optimism I had not heard from him since before the banquet. He said that Marcus had personally recommended this broader dialogue, citing his conversation with me as evidence that genuine understanding, however difficult to achieve, remained possible between our two peoples, if approached with sufficient patience and honesty on both sides. I felt a small surge of hope at this news, though it remained tempered by the knowledge that one honest conversation, however meaningful, could not fully repair the damage my earlier words had caused. Genuine trust, I was beginning to understand, required more than a single moment of clarity. It required sustained effort, demonstrated over time, before it could be considered truly rebuilt. The broader meeting took place 2 days later, in a larger conference room aboard the station rather than the quiet reckoning itself. A deliberate choice, I later learned, meant to signal that both sides were willing to meet each other partway, rather than expecting the other to always accommodate their preferences. Scientists and historians from 3 neighboring compact outposts had traveled to attend, along with Captain Ray, Grace Ellison, and several human historians I had not previously met, specialists in humanity's own complicated past who had been specifically requested to help facilitate genuine cross-cultural understanding. Marcus attended as well, though he remained largely quiet throughout the formal proceedings, observing rather than actively participating in the detailed historical discussions that dominated much of the meeting. I found myself glancing toward him occasionally, still uncertain of exactly where our relationship stood, still carrying the weight of what I had said, and the genuine effort I hoped to demonstrate in repairing it. The human historians, a woman named Diana Hartley and a man named Oliver Bright, spoke with a careful precision that reminded me strongly of Marcus's own measured explanations. They described, in broader terms than Marcus had shared privately, the general shape of humanity's difficult history, always careful to frame specific details as belonging to individual families and communities, rather than something to be catalogued for outside consumption. I listened carefully, comparing what they shared publicly against what Marcus had told me privately, noticing how the public account remained deliberately less personal, more focused on broad historical patterns and the philosophical lessons humanity had extracted from their difficult past, rather than the specific, painful details of individual suffering. Diana Hartley explained that humanity's approach to interstellar diplomacy had been shaped almost entirely by their difficult history, that every protocol, every careful gesture of restraint, every deliberate choice to approach new species with patience rather than immediate assertion of strength, traced directly back to lessons learned during their darkest period. She said that humanity understood, perhaps more intimately than most species could easily imagine, exactly how quickly unchecked power could spiral into catastrophe, and that their entire approach to the wider galaxy had been built around avoiding any repetition of that pattern. One of the compact historians, an elder scholar named Corwin Vale, asked directly why humanity chose to maintain such careful restraint, even when other species might interpret that restraint as weakness or hesitation. Oliver Bright answered this question with a patience that reminded me strongly of Marcus, explaining that humanity had learned, through devastating experience, that restraint born of genuine strength looked very different from restraint born of weakness, even if outside observers sometimes struggled to distinguish between the two. He said that humanity's willingness to absorb insult, to walk away from confrontation rather than immediately escalating, reflected not an inability to respond forcefully, but a deliberate, hard-won commitment to choosing peace whenever peace remained genuinely possible. I found myself thinking, as he spoke, about Marcus's quiet departure from the banquet hall, about how I had initially interpreted his silence and his careful, measured removal of his armor as some kind of weakness or overreaction. I understood now that what I had witnessed was not weakness at all, but the exact restraint Oliver Bright was describing, a choice to withdraw with dignity rather than escalate a confrontation that could easily have grown far more damaging had Marcus responded with anger instead of quiet, deliberate departure. The meeting continued for several more hours, covering topics ranging from historical philosophy to practical protocols for future diplomatic engagement between our peoples. I contributed occasionally, offering translations or clarifications where needed, but mostly I listened, absorbing every detail, feeling my earlier confident assumptions about humanity continuing to crumble beneath the weight of genuine, careful understanding. Toward the end of the session, Elder Corvan raised a question that I suspected he had been building toward throughout the entire meeting, asking Captain Ray directly what humanity hoped to gain from continued relations with the Compact, given the difficulties that had already arisen during this very first extended contact. Captain Ray's answer struck me with its simplicity and its quiet sincerity. He said that humanity did not seek relations with other species purely for strategic or material advantage. though such advantages certainly existed and were welcomed when they arose naturally from genuine cooperation. He said that humanity sought understanding above all else, a chance to be known accurately by the wider galaxy, rather than reduced to rumor and exaggerated fear, and a chance, in turn. He said that the incident at the banquet, difficult as it had been, actually represented an opportunity rather than a setback, provided both sides were willing to engage honestly with what had happened, rather than simply papering over the discomfort with polite diplomatic language. He said that genuine understanding often required passing through moments of genuine difficulty, and that how both sides chose to handle that difficulty would determine far more about the future of our relations than the initial mistake itself. I felt the weight of his words settle over me, understanding that my careless comments at the banquet, while genuinely harmful, had inadvertently created a foundation for something potentially far more valuable than the shallow, cautious politeness that might otherwise have characterized our early interactions. By forcing both sides to confront a genuine difficulty honestly, rather than avoiding it, we had created space for a depth of understanding that might never have developed through more comfortable, superficial exchanges. As the meeting concluded and attendees began filing out of the conference room, Marcus approached me directly for the first time since our private conversation aboard his ship. He did not speak immediately, simply studying me for a moment with an expression I found difficult to read, though it no longer carried the guarded caution I had noticed during our earlier meeting. He told me that he had noticed my attentiveness throughout the broader discussion, my careful attention to the nuances the historians had shared, and that this attentiveness suggested genuine engagement rather than mere obligation. He said that this was exactly the kind of sustained effort he had hoped to see following our private conversation, evidence that my earlier apology had reflected genuine understanding rather than simply the right words spoken at the right moment to satisfy diplomatic necessity. I thanked him for his patience throughout the entire ordeal, acknowledging that I still had much to learn about humanity and about the broader lesson his people had extracted from their difficult history. I told him that I hoped to continue demonstrating genuine effort, not just through words, but through how I approached every future interaction between our peoples. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since the banquet, I saw something that resembled genuine warmth in his expression, though it remained tempered by the careful, measured caution that seemed fundamental to his character. He told me that trust, once damaged, rebuilt slowly, through consistent demonstration rather than singular grand gestures, and that he appreciated my willingness to engage in that slower, more difficult process rather than seeking some quick, convenient resolution to the discomfort I had caused. As I walked back to my own quarters that evening, I found myself reflecting on how much my understanding had shifted over the course of just a few days. I had arrived at this posting with confident assumptions about humanity, built on second-hand rumor and casual prejudice, assumptions I had never bothered to question because they conveniently confirmed what I already believed about a species I had never actually taken the time to understand. Now, through genuine effort and the patient willingness of people like Grace, Marcus, and the human historians, I was beginning to see humanity not as a curiosity to be studied from a comfortable distance, but as a people who had endured something profound and had chosen, deliberately and with great effort, to build something better from the ashes of their own near destruction. I thought about Eleanor, about the armor she had passed down through generations of her family, about the careful, deliberate choice to remember suffering, not for the sake of dwelling in pain, but for the sake of ensuring that future generations never repeated the mistakes that had caused it. I understood now that this was not weakness, as I had so carelessly suggested at the banquet, but perhaps the deepest kind of strength imaginable, the strength to remember difficult truths honestly, rather than conveniently forgetting them for the sake of comfort. I did not yet know how much further this journey of understanding would take me, or how completely it would reshape not just my personal relationship with Marcus and his crew, but the broader relationship developing between our two peoples. I only knew that I had begun to see something I had never expected to find when the quiet reckoning first arrived at our station, something that went far beyond simple diplomatic cooperation into a genuine, if still fragile, foundation of mutual respect and understanding. That understanding, I was beginning to realize, had been available to me from the very beginning, if only I had approached my initial encounter with genuine curiosity rather than careless assumption. The lesson, painful as it had been to learn, would stay with me far longer than any comfortable ignorance ever could have. 6 days after the broader historical meeting concluded, the station's alarms tore through the quiet routine of my morning with a suddenness that left no room for gradual realization. I was reviewing translation records in my quarters when the sound hit, sharp and insistent, followed almost immediately by an announcement from Elder Corvain's office ordering all personnel to secure stations and prepare for potential hostile contact. My hands went cold as I scrambled toward the central command deck, my mind racing through every protocol I had memorized but never expected to actually use. Unknown vessels had appeared at the edge of our sensor range, moving with an aggressive formation that our systems immediately flagged as consistent with raider activity, a loose confederation of scavengers and opportunists, known throughout this region for targeting vulnerable outposts during moments of diplomatic transition, when defenses might be distracted or divided by unfamiliar protocols. I arrived at the command deck to find it already crowded with officers shouting coordinates and defensive assignments, the usual calm efficiency of station operations replaced by the barely controlled urgency of genuine crisis. Elder Corvain stood at the central display, his expression tight with concentration as he studied the approaching formation, 3 vessels moving in a pattern designed to test our defenses before committing to any direct engagement. I asked one of the junior officers nearest me how serious the threat actually was, and her answer did nothing to calm the tightness building in my chest. She told me that our station's defenses, while adequate for routine security, had never been tested against a coordinated raider assault of this scale, and that our nearest reinforcement fleet remained more than a full day away, far too distant to offer any immediate assistance. I thought immediately of the quiet reckoning, still docked in our bay, and wondered whether Captain Ray and his crew would simply remain aboard their vessel, protected by whatever defenses their own ship possessed, while the rest of us faced whatever came next entirely on our own. I did not have to wonder for long. Captain Ray's voice came through the command deck's communication system less than 5 minutes after the initial alarm, calm and steady, despite the chaos surrounding us, requesting immediate coordination with station defense systems, and offering the full capabilities of his vessel to assist in whatever response Elder Corvain deemed necessary. Corvain accepted without hesitation, and within minutes, the quiet reckoning had detached from its docking clamps, moving into defensive position alongside our station's own limited fleet with a precision that spoke of extensive tactical training rather than mere improvisation. I watched the tactical display with growing amazement as the human vessel began coordinating seamlessly with our own defense systems, sharing sensor data, adjusting formation to cover gaps in our coverage that our own officers had not even fully identified yet. It became clear within minutes that whatever reputation humanity carried for restraint and careful diplomacy did not translate into hesitation or weakness when genuine threat presented itself. The raider vessels continued their approach, testing our combined defensive formation with probing maneuvers that our officers correctly identified as attempts to locate weaknesses before committing to a full engagement. Throughout this tense standoff, Captain Ray's voice remained a steady presence over shared communication channels, offering tactical suggestions with a calm confidence that helped steady the growing panic among our own less experienced officers. I found myself standing near Elder Corvain, watching the display with a mixture of fear and fascination, when Marcus's voice suddenly joined the communication channel, requesting permission to address the raider vessels directly before any further escalation occurred. Corvain, surprised by the request, granted permission after only a brief hesitation, and I listened as Marcus's voice carried across an open channel to the approaching ships, his tone carrying none of the aggressive posturing I might have expected, but instead a calm, measured warning that somehow felt more unsettling than any threat could have been. He informed the raider vessels, in simple, direct language, that they were approaching a combined human and compact defensive position, that their current formation had already been fully analyzed and countered, and that any further aggressive action would be met with a response calibrated specifically to end hostilities as quickly and decisively as possible, while minimizing unnecessary harm to all parties involved, including the raiders themselves. The raider vessels paused in their approach, clearly recalculating their assessment of the situation now that a human vessel had revealed itself as part of the defensive formation. I understood, watching this hesitation unfold on the tactical display, that humanity's reputation, whatever mixture of fact and exaggeration it contained, carried genuine weight even among opportunistic raiders who might otherwise have targeted a compact station without a second thought. For several tense minutes, the outcome remained uncertain, the raider vessels holding position at the edge of engagement range, while their commanders presumably debated whether to press forward or withdraw entirely. I found myself holding my breath, watching Marcus's calm presence on the communication display, understanding now that the same restraint I had once mistaken for weakness represented something far more formidable, a capability held carefully in check, rather than an absence of capability altogether. Finally, the raider vessels began a slow, deliberate withdrawal, their formation breaking apart as they retreated back toward whatever hidden staging point they had launched their probing assault from. The tension on the command deck broke into a wave of relieved exhaling, though Elder Corvain remained cautious, ordering continued vigilance until the raiders had moved entirely beyond our sensor range. Once the immediate threat had fully passed, Corvain turned to me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something between exhausted relief and genuine gratitude. He told me that without the Quiet Reckoning's assistance, our station's defenses would likely have been overwhelmed, that the coordinated response Captain Ray and his crew had provided had almost certainly prevented significant harm to everyone stationed here. He said that this crisis had revealed something important about the nature of humanity's careful restraint, something he suspected many species in the wider galaxy still failed to properly understand. I asked him what exactly he meant, and his answer echoed thoughts I had already begun forming as I watched the entire confrontation unfold. He said that humanity's restraint, the same restraint I had once carelessly dismissed as insecurity or weakness, existed precisely because they possessed genuine strength held in careful check. He said that a species truly weak or insecure would have needed to demonstrate aggressive posturing constantly, proving their capability at every opportunity, out of anxious need for validation. Humanity, by contrast, could afford genuine patience and restraint precisely because they understood their own capability so thoroughly that they felt no need to prove it except when circumstances genuinely demanded a response. I thought immediately of Marcus's armor, of Eleanor's hard-won wisdom passed down through generations, of the careful, deliberate choice humanity had made to remember the cost of unchecked power, rather than celebrating power for its own sake. As I understood now, watching this crisis resolve through calm, measured strength, rather than reckless aggression, exactly what that armor truly represented, and exactly how badly I had misjudged its meaning during that fateful banquet. Later that day, once the immediate crisis had fully passed and station operations had returned to their normal routine, I sought out Marcus aboard the Quiet Reckoning, finding him in the ship's cargo hold, methodically checking and organizing supplies with the same quiet diligence Grace had described during our very first conversation weeks earlier. He looked up as I entered, his expression calm despite the tension of the day's events, and I found myself, for the first time since our initial meeting, feeling genuine ease in his presence, rather than the anxious uncertainty that had characterized every previous interaction. I told him what I had witnessed during the crisis, how his calm warning to the raider vessels had revealed something about humanity's true nature that no amount of historical study could have taught me as clearly as watching it unfold in real time. I told him I finally understood, not just intellectually but genuinely, why his armor represented strength rather than insecurity, restraint born of genuine capability rather than fear or weakness. He listened carefully, and when I finished speaking, something shifted in his expression, a warmth that reminded me of how Grace had described him during our very first conversation, before my careless words had damaged the fragile trust beginning to form between our peoples. He told me that today's crisis, difficult as it had been, had perhaps demonstrated more clearly than any conversation could have exactly what he had been trying to help me understand during our private meeting. He said that humanity's restraint was never about weakness or hesitation, but about the deliberate choice to hold genuine strength in careful reserve, deployed only when circumstances truly demanded it, and always with the goal of ending conflict as quickly and decisively as possible, rather than prolonging it unnecessarily. I asked him whether today's events had changed anything about how he viewed our earlier conflict, whether witnessing this crisis together had helped rebuild some of the trust my careless words had damaged. He considered the question carefully, and his answer carried a genuine warmth I had not heard from him since before the banquet. He told me that trust rebuilt slowly, through many small moments rather than singular dramatic events, but that today's crisis had certainly represented a meaningful step forward, an opportunity for both our peoples to see each other clearly during genuine difficulty, rather than through the comfortable distance of formal diplomatic ceremony. I left that conversation feeling something I had not felt since arriving at this posting, a genuine sense of hope that the relationship between our peoples, however difficult its beginning had been, might yet develop into something far more valuable than the cautious, distant cooperation that had characterized our first tentative days of contact. I did not yet know how much further this journey would take me, or how completely the events of that single chaotic day would reshape not just my personal understanding of humanity, but the broader foundation of trust developing between our two peoples. I only knew that something important had shifted during those tense minutes on the command deck, something that went far beyond simple military cooperation into a genuine, hard-won recognition of exactly what humanity truly represented among the wider community of species we all called neighbors across the vast, uncertain expanse of the stars. In the days following the radar crisis, the entire station seemed to shift into a different rhythm, one where the earlier caution and suspicion between our peoples had begun giving way to something closer to genuine partnership. Officers who had once regarded the human crew with wary distance now sought out their company during meal periods, exchanging stories and small courtesies that would have seemed unthinkable during those first tense days following my careless words at the banquet. Elder Corvain called me into his office again on the morning of the 8th day since the crisis, though this time his expression carried none of the tension or disappointment I had grown accustomed to seeing during our previous meetings. He informed me that Captain Ray had requested my continued involvement as primary liaison for an extended period, citing the genuine progress I had demonstrated in understanding humanity's history and perspective, and expressing confidence that I could help facilitate deeper cooperation between our peoples going forward. I felt a genuine swell of pride at this news, tempered by the continued awareness of how much I still had to learn, how many assumptions I likely still carried without fully recognizing them. I thanked Corvain for his patience throughout the entire difficult process, acknowledging that I would not have reached this point of understanding without his insistence that I confront the full weight of what my careless words had caused. He told me that leadership sometimes required exactly this kind of difficult confrontation, forcing subordinates to face uncomfortable truths rather than allowing convenient ignorance to persist unchallenged. He said that my genuine growth over the past days had convinced him that the entire painful episode, difficult as it had been, had ultimately served a valuable purpose in strengthening, rather than permanently damaging, our relationship with humanity. That afternoon, I found myself aboard the Quiet Reckoning once more, this time not for a formal meeting, but at Grace Ellison's casual invitation to observe the ship's medical bay during a routine health assessment of the crew. She explained that she thought it might help me understand humanity more completely if I could observe the ordinary, unremarkable aspects of their daily life, rather than only the formal diplomatic occasions that had characterized our interactions so far. I watched as she moved through routine checkups with practiced efficiency, chatting easily with crew members about minor complaints and small updates on their physical well-being, the entire scene feeling refreshingly ordinary after the intensity of recent events. I found myself genuinely enjoying this glimpse into the mundane rhythms of human shipboard life, understanding that genuine cultural knowledge required exactly this kind of exposure to ordinary moments, rather than only dramatic crises or formal ceremonies. Marcus arrived partway through the afternoon, seeking a routine checkup of his own, and I noticed how naturally he greeted me now, without the guarded caution that had characterized our interactions during those first difficult days. He asked how my continued research into human history was progressing, and I found myself sharing genuine enthusiasm about connections I had begun drawing between humanity's historical experience and similar, though less severe, periods of difficulty within my own people's past. He listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering his own perspective on parallels between our respective histories, and I realized, during this easy conversation, that we had moved into something resembling genuine friendship, built not on the absence of past difficulty, but on the honest confrontation and resolution of that difficulty. I asked him, during a quiet moment while Grace attended to another crew member, whether he had always intended to forgive my earlier words, or whether something specific during our private conversation had convinced him that genuine reconciliation remained possible. He considered the question with his usual thoughtful patience before answering, and his response revealed a depth of wisdom that continued to reshape my understanding of what genuine strength actually meant. He told me that forgiveness, for humanity, was never really about deciding whether someone deserved it in some abstract, calculated sense. It was about recognizing genuine potential for growth and change, and choosing to invest in that potential rather than remaining permanently fixed on the harm already caused. He said that Eleanor herself, despite everything she had suffered during the long conflict, had spent the remainder of her life practicing exactly this kind of deliberate forgiveness, understanding that holding on to anger indefinitely served no one, least of all the person carrying that anger. I asked whether this philosophy extended to every situation, no matter how severe the initial harm might have been, and he acknowledged that genuine forgiveness required corresponding genuine effort from the person seeking it, that forgiveness without accountability risked enabling continued harm rather than fostering genuine growth. He said that what had made reconciliation possible between us was not simply his willingness to forgive, but my genuine willingness to confront the full weight of what I had done and to demonstrate sustained effort toward understanding rather than seeking quick, convenient resolution. I found myself reflecting, as our conversation continued, on how differently this entire situation might have unfolded had Marcus responded to my initial insult with anger rather than quiet, dignified withdrawal. Had he chosen confrontation in that moment, the resulting tension might have prevented any possibility of the genuine understanding we had since developed. His choice to walk away, rather than escalate, had created exactly the kind of space needed for reflection and growth, both for myself individually and for the broader relationship between our peoples. I mentioned this observation to him, and he nodded slowly, acknowledging that this had indeed been part of his intention, even in that painful moment of walking away from the banquet table. He said that immediate confrontation, however emotionally satisfying it might have felt in the moment, rarely produced the kind of lasting understanding that patient, deliberate withdrawal, followed by honest conversation, could achieve. He told me that this preference for patient withdrawal over immediate confrontation traced directly back to lessons learned during the long conflict, when countless opportunities for de-escalation had been squandered by leaders too proud or too emotionally reactive to choose patience over immediate, satisfying confrontation. Humanity's collective decision, following that devastating experience, had been to cultivate exactly this kind of deliberate patience, understanding that the immediate emotional satisfaction of confrontation rarely served long-term wisdom or genuine resolution. I left the quiet reckoning that evening with a profound sense of gratitude for everything Marcus and his crew had taught me, not through lecture or formal instruction, but through patient demonstration of principles I was only now beginning to fully appreciate. I understood that the lessons humanity had extracted from their difficult history extended far beyond simple historical facts into a genuinely transformed way of approaching conflict, disagreement, and the messy, difficult process of building trust between different peoples. Over the following week, I continued deepening my understanding of humanity's history and culture, spending increasing time aboard the quiet reckoning, observing their routines, participating in casual conversations that gradually revealed layers of nuance I had completely missed during my earlier, more superficial engagement. I began drafting detailed reports for Elder Corvain and the broader Compact leadership, hoping to correct some of the misunderstandings and exaggerated assumptions that had shaped our people's earlier perception of humanity. Elder Corvain reviewed my reports with evident approval, noting that this kind of genuine, nuanced understanding would prove invaluable as our peoples continued building the foundation of cooperation that recent events had helped establish. He informed me that Captain Ray had requested a formal ceremony marking the successful resolution of our earlier difficulties, scheduled for the day before the Quiet Reckoning was set to depart for its next destination, and that my continued presence and involvement would be essential to ensuring this ceremony properly honored the genuine growth both our peoples had experienced. I felt a mixture of anticipation and lingering nervousness at this news, aware that this final ceremony would represent something of a culmination to the entire difficult journey that had begun with my careless words at that first banquet. I found myself hoping, with genuine sincerity, that I could offer something meaningful during this final gathering, something that would properly honor everything Marcus and his crew had taught me during these past weeks of patient, difficult reconciliation. That night, as I prepared for what I understood would be a significant final gathering, I found myself thinking once more about Eleanor, about the armor she had worn, and the wisdom she had passed down through generations of her family. I thought about how a single object, carried carefully across time, could hold within it an entire philosophy of restraint, remembrance, and hard-won wisdom about the true nature of strength. I understood now, with a clarity that felt hard-won rather than simply intellectually acquired, that the armor I had once dismissed as mere costume represented something far more profound, a physical embodiment of humanity's entire philosophical journey, from near destruction to deliberate, careful rebuilding. I understood that wearing it was never about intimidation or display, but about honoring memory, carrying forward lessons too important to forget, and demonstrating, through quiet consistency rather than loud proclamation, exactly what genuine strength actually meant. As I finally settled into sleep that night, I found myself genuinely grateful for the painful journey that had brought me to this point of understanding, recognizing that without my initial careless mistake, I might never have been forced to confront and ultimately transform such deeply held, unexamined assumptions about a species I had once dismissed with such casual, unwarranted confidence. The morning of the departure ceremony arrived with a strange mixture of anticipation and reluctance settling over the entire station, as though everyone involved understood that something meaningful was about to conclude, even as new possibilities continued opening before us. I woke early, having barely slept through the night, my thoughts circling continuously around everything that had transpired since that first fateful evening at the banquet table. Elder Corvain had arranged the ceremony to take place in the same hall where the original banquet had occurred, a deliberate choice meant to symbolically transform a space associated with painful misunderstanding into one representing genuine reconciliation and hard-won mutual respect. Station staff had spent the previous evening preparing the hall, though this time the decorations carried a different quality, less formal grandeur, and more genuine warmth, reflecting the authentic relationship that had developed over these past weeks, rather than merely performing diplomatic ceremony for its own sake. I arrived early, wanting to ensure everything was properly prepared before the human delegation joined us, and found Elder Corvain already present, examining the hall with a satisfied expression that suggested he too recognized the significance of transforming this particular space. He greeted me warmly, a warmth that would have seemed impossible during those first difficult days following my careless mistake, and told me that Captain Ray had specifically requested that I play a central role in today's ceremony, given everything I had learned and demonstrated throughout this entire difficult journey of understanding. I asked what exactly this role would entail, feeling a nervous flutter of anticipation at the prospect of formal responsibility during such a significant occasion. Corvain explained that Marcus had left something specific in my care following our very first private conversation, something I had nearly forgotten about amid everything else that had transpired since. He gestured toward a covered object resting on a side table near the hall's entrance, and as I approached and lifted the covering, I found myself looking once more at the armor Marcus had removed and left behind on that first difficult evening. I had assumed, without ever directly confirming, That station staff had eventually returned the armor to Marcus following that initial incident. Learning now that it had remained here, entrusted to my care throughout this entire journey of understanding, filled me with a complicated mixture of emotions I struggled to immediately process. Corvain explained that Marcus had specifically requested the armor remain in my keeping, understanding that my genuine journey toward understanding would only be complete once I personally returned it to him, not as a mere formality, but as a deliberate, symbolic act representing the restoration of trust between us and, by extension, between our two peoples. I felt the weight of this responsibility settle over me as I carefully lifted the armor, examining once more the worn plating, the subtle etchings that told a story I now understood far more completely than I had during that first careless evening. Each scratch and worn edge no longer seemed like evidence of humanity's supposed insecurity, but instead represented something precious, a physical testament to survival, wisdom, and the deliberate choice to remember difficult truths rather than convenient fictions. The human delegation arrived shortly after, Captain Ray leading Grace Ellison, several crew members I had come to know well over these past weeks, and finally Marcus himself, walking with the same quiet, unhurried confidence I remembered from our very first meeting, though now I understood that confidence not as arrogance, but as the genuine calm of someone who had made peace with difficult history, rather than being controlled by it. Elder Corvain opened the ceremony with brief remarks, acknowledging the difficult journey our peoples had traveled together since that first tense arrival, and expressing genuine gratitude for the patience both sides had demonstrated throughout the process of building authentic understanding rather than settling for superficial diplomatic courtesy. Captain Ray responded with equal warmth, noting that humanity had learned as much from this experience as our own people had, that genuine cross-cultural understanding always required exactly this kind of patient, sometimes uncomfortable process of confronting misunderstanding honestly rather than avoiding difficult conversations for the sake of comfortable convenience. Then, as the formal remarks concluded, Elder Corvain gestured toward me, indicating that the moment had arrived for me to fulfill the responsibility Marcus had entrusted to my care. I stepped forward, carrying the armor carefully, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall settling upon me, as they had during that very different moment weeks earlier, when my careless words had caused such genuine harm. This time, however, the weight of attention felt different, charged not with the discomfort of witnessed insult, but with the anticipation of witnessed reconciliation. I approached Marcus directly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us carrying an entirely different quality than the silence that had followed my earlier careless words. This silence felt full rather than empty, weighted with genuine understanding rather than shocked discomfort. I told him, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet hall, that I had spent these past weeks learning not just facts about humanity's difficult history, but something far more important, a genuine understanding of what that history meant, and why the armor I now held represented strength, rather than the insecurity I had so carelessly assumed during our first difficult meeting. I told him that I understood now, with a clarity I could not have imagined possessing during that first evening, that this armor represented Eleanor's hard-won wisdom, humanity's collective commitment to remembering difficult truths, and the deliberate choice to hold genuine strength in careful reserve rather than deploying it recklessly or unnecessarily. I offered him the armor then, extending it with both hands in the traditional gesture of respect my own people reserved for moments of genuine significance, acknowledging that I was not simply returning an object, but attempting to demonstrate, through this deliberate act, the genuine transformation that had occurred within my own understanding over these past difficult weeks. Marcus accepted the armor slowly, his movements deliberate and measured, and I watched as he began putting it on once more, piece by piece, with far more care and deliberation than I had noticed during our very first meeting, before any of this difficulty had occurred between us. When he finished, standing once more in the full weight of Eleanor's inherited armor, he looked at me with an expression that carried genuine warmth alongside the careful, measured wisdom I had come to associate with him throughout our journey together. He told me, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, that watching me learn to understand this armor's true meaning had reminded him why humanity continued reaching out toward the wider galaxy, despite the painful history that shaped their cautious, deliberate approach to new relationships. He said that genuine understanding between different peoples remained possible, even after painful misunderstanding, provided both sides demonstrated genuine willingness to confront difficulty honestly, rather than avoiding it for the sake of comfortable convenience. He told me that the galaxy would continue meeting more humans as their people expanded further into the wider community of species inhabiting these vast reaches of space, and that not every encounter would proceed as smoothly or as thoughtfully as ours ultimately had, despite its difficult beginning. He asked me, directly and with genuine sincerity, to help ensure that future liaisons and diplomatic representatives from my own people approached humanity with the kind of genuine curiosity and respect I had ultimately developed, rather than the careless assumption that had characterized my own initial encounter. I promised him, with complete sincerity, that I would dedicate myself to exactly this purpose, sharing everything I had learned with future generations of compact diplomats and representatives, ensuring that the painful lesson I had learned through my own mistake might spare others from repeating similar errors in their own encounters with humanity. Captain Ray stepped forward then, addressing the assembled gathering with remarks that seemed to draw the entire difficult journey toward a fitting, meaningful conclusion. He spoke of how genuine cooperation between different peoples required exactly this kind of patient, sometimes uncomfortable process of honest confrontation and authentic understanding, rather than the superficial diplomatic courtesy that often characterized first contact between unfamiliar species. He announced that humanity intended to establish more formal channels of ongoing communication and cooperation with the Compact, building upon the genuine foundation of understanding that had developed through this difficult but ultimately valuable experience. He expressed hope that future interactions between our peoples might benefit from lessons learned during this particular encounter, even as new challenges and misunderstandings would inevitably arise as our relationship continued developing over time. Elder Corvain responded with genuine enthusiasm, committing the full support of our station and the broader Compact leadership toward continuing and deepening this newly established relationship with humanity. He noted that the entire episode, difficult as its beginning had been, had ultimately demonstrated something valuable about both our peoples, a mutual capacity for growth, understanding, and genuine reconciliation even after significant misunderstanding. As the formal ceremony concluded and the gathering began transitioning into more casual conversation and celebration, I found myself standing near Grace Ellison, who offered a warm smile that carried none of the guarded caution I remembered from our earlier interactions during the most difficult period of this entire journey. She told me she was genuinely proud of the growth she had witnessed in me over these past weeks, noting that few people demonstrated the kind of sustained, genuine effort required to transform careless prejudice into authentic understanding and respect. She said that this transformation, difficult and uncomfortable as it had undoubtedly been, represented exactly the kind of growth humanity hoped to inspire through their patient, careful approach to diplomatic relations with new species. I thanked her for her patience throughout this entire process, acknowledging that without her initial willingness to explain Eleanor's history and the true meaning behind Marcus's armor, I might never have found the path toward genuine understanding that had ultimately transformed my perspective so completely. As the celebration continued into the evening, I found myself reflecting on the strange, difficult journey that had brought me to this point, beginning with careless words spoken from a place of unexamined prejudice and confident ignorance, and ending with genuine friendship, mutual respect, and a transformed understanding of what true strength actually meant. I thought about Eleanor, whom I had never met and would never have the opportunity to meet, yet whose wisdom, carried forward through her armor and through the careful teaching of her descendants, had fundamentally reshaped my own understanding of an entire species I had once dismissed with such careless, unwarranted confidence. I thought about the Raider crisis, about watching humanity's restraint transform, when genuinely necessary, into decisive, controlled strength, understanding now that this capacity for controlled strength represented the true source of the quiet confidence I had witnessed From the very first moment Marcus stepped through that docking door, wearing armor I had so completely misunderstood. Later that evening, as the quiet reckoning prepared for its final departure the following morning, Marcus found me standing alone near the observation window, watching the stars beyond our station, with a mixture of reflection and quiet contentment that felt earned rather than simply given. He joined me without speaking for a long moment, both of us simply watching the distant stars together in comfortable silence before he finally spoke, his voice carrying the same calm patience I had come to deeply respect throughout our difficult journey together. He told me that he believed our two peoples had found something valuable through this entire difficult process, a foundation of understanding that would likely prove more resilient than if our first encounter had proceeded smoothly, without the difficult confrontation and genuine reconciliation that had ultimately characterized our relationship. I asked him whether he believed I had truly earned his forgiveness, or whether some lingering doubt remained about my genuine transformation throughout these past weeks. He considered the question with his usual thoughtful patience before answering, and his response carried the weight of genuine sincerity rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. He told me that forgiveness, once genuinely offered, did not require continuous reaffirmation through repeated questioning. He said that my sustained effort throughout these difficult weeks had spoken far more clearly than any words could, demonstrating exactly the kind of genuine growth that made forgiveness meaningful rather than merely convenient. He told me that he looked forward to hearing, through whatever future communications passed between our peoples, how I continued applying the understanding I had developed throughout this journey, helping ensure that future encounters between humanity and the wider galaxy might benefit from the hard-won wisdom we had both discovered through this particular, difficult experience. As the quiet reckoning finally departed the following morning, disengaging from our station's docking clamps and moving gradually toward the edge of our sensor range, before finally vanishing into the vast darkness beyond, I stood at the observation window alongside Elder Corvain, watching until the ship's running lights had completely faded from view. Corvain turned to me eventually, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between us, and told me that he believed our station, and indeed our entire people, owed a genuine debt of gratitude to my own difficult, uncomfortable journey of growth throughout these recent weeks. He said that the lessons I had learned, painful as their origin had been, would likely prove invaluable as our peoples continued navigating the complicated, ever-expanding relationship between the compact and the wider human diaspora spreading steadily throughout the galaxy. I told him, with genuine sincerity, that I hope to spend the coming years dedicating myself to exactly this purpose, ensuring that the painful lesson born from my own careless words might ultimately serve to prevent similar misunderstandings from damaging future encounters between our peoples and the many others we would inevitably continue meeting as both our civilizations expanded further into the vast, mysterious reaches of space that stretched endlessly before us. I thought, one final time, of Marcus laying down his armor on that banquet table weeks earlier, of the quiet dignity with which he had walked away, rather than escalating a confrontation that could easily have damaged our relationship far more permanently than it ultimately did. I understood now, with complete clarity, that this single act of quiet restraint had taught me more about genuine strength than any lecture or historical account ever could have, demonstrating that true power lay not in aggressive assertion, but in the deliberate, thoughtful choice to walk away when walking away served wisdom better than confrontation ever could. The stars continued their slow, silent progression outside the observation window, indifferent to the small, significant transformation that had occurred within this single station over these recent weeks, yet I understood that something genuinely important had shifted, not just within my own understanding, but within the broader relationship developing between two very different peoples learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, exactly how to understand and respect each other across the vast, complicated distance that had once seemed to separate us entirely.